What if I told you that a German policy expert just called Canada's Prime Minister, and I'm quoting here, a better European than we are? Not a French diplomat, not an EU commissioner, a German strategist, on the record, saying that Mark Carney understands Europe's biggest vulnerability better than Europe itself does. And that vulnerability? Total, suffocating dependence on American technology. Tonight, we're going to unpack something the mainstream media is barely touching. Because what's happening right now between Ottawa and Brussels isn't just trade diplomacy. It's the blueprint for a third pole in global power. And Canada is at the dead center of it. Breaking tonight, Europe's digital strategy just found an unexpected anchor. Canada didn't wait to be invited. They showed up with answers. Tensions are reshaping transatlantic relationships at a speed nobody predicted. Europe has spent years warning about its dangerous reliance on American big tech. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, companies that essentially control European data, European infrastructure, European digital life. But warnings without alternatives are just noise, and Europe knows it. Everyone believed Canada would remain a junior partner in transatlantic affairs. Washington expected Ottawa to stay in its lane. Analysts assumed that any European pivot away from American tech would look east, toward Asia, or inward, toward homegrown solutions that never quite materialized. They were all utterly incorrect. Davos, January 2026. Standing on the world's most watched economic stage, Prime Minister Mark Carney made a statement that electrified European capitals. He called it a rupture in the world order. Not a disagreement, not a tension, a rupture. And when a former central banker, a man who ran the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, uses that word, every finance ministry in Europe pays attention. Translation: Carney just told the world that the old order is dead, and Canada is ready to help build what comes next. And what happened next? The country that sits on some of the largest critical mineral reserves on Earth, that punches well above its weight in artificial intelligence research, that already has a provisional trade agreement with Europe, that country became the partner Brussels started calling first. Dear viewers, between Davos and now, something extraordinary has been unfolding between Canada and Europe. And it goes far deeper than anyone expected. Let's start with what Europe actually needs, because this isn't abstract, this is survival. Martin Hullin, Director of Network for Technological Resilience and Sovereignty at Germany's Bertelsmann Stiftung, put it bluntly. He said Carney was very courageous in sending such a strong signal at Davos. But then came the critical part. Hullin said Davos has given Canada a window of trust with Europe. A window, not a door, not a permanent arrangement. A window that could close if Ottawa doesn't deliver. And here's why that window matters so much. Europe is trapped in a digital ecosystem controlled almost entirely by American corporations. European governments, hospitals, militaries, schools, they all run on American cloud infrastructure, American operating systems, American AI platforms. And in a world where Donald Trump has turned trade into a weapon, where the USMCA review hangs over every North American negotiation like a storm cloud, Europe is terrified of what happens if Washington decides to weaponize that digital dependence. Johan Linåker, senior researcher at Sweden's RISE Research Institutes, said it plainly. Europe will never become digitally independent, nor should they try to be. But the continent needs to become far more resilient. Treat digital infrastructure as a critical asset that can function in a crisis. Not a luxury, not a convenience, a critical asset. Like energy, like water, like defense. And that's where Canada enters the picture. Not as a replacement for American tech. Nobody is replacing Google overnight, but as something potentially more valuable. A trusted alternative, a strategic anchor that gives Europe options it doesn't currently have. Now let's talk about the dimension that's already moving fastest. defense. Carney spent the latter half of 2025 doing something that barely made headlines, but could reshape transatlantic security for decades. He secured Canada's participation in SAFE, Security Action for Europe, a program that provides up to 150 billion euros in loans to EU member states for large-scale defense projects. Ammunition, missiles, drones, artillery systems, infantry weapons. This is not symbolic. This is industrial-scale defense cooperation. Raluca Csernatoni, research fellow at Carnegie Europe in Brussels, called it a generational opportunity for deeper transatlantic cooperation. And she added something crucial. She called it a very lucrative opportunity for the Canadian defense sector. Think about what that means. Canadian companies, Canadian workers, Canadian innovation, integrated into Europe's defense supply chain at a moment when Europe is spending more on security than at any point since the Cold War. But Csernatoni also raised the alarm. The EU has given SAFE a deadline of 2030, and anyone who knows defense procurement knows that major deals take years to finalize. Time is running out. Political will needs to translate into signed contracts, and it needs to happen fast. The political will is there, Csernatoni confirmed, but the proof, she said, is in the pudding. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because defense is just the entry point. The real game is in technology governance, critical minerals, and who gets to write the rules of the digital economy for the next 50 years. Canada sits on massive reserves of critical raw materials, minerals that Europe desperately needs and currently sources overwhelmingly from China. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths, the building blocks of batteries, semiconductors, electric vehicles, and advanced weapons systems. If Canada can open a reliable supply chain to the EU, it doesn't just diversify European sourcing, it fundamentally shifts the balance of power in the global resource competition between Washington and Beijing. And then there's artificial intelligence. Canada has world-class AI expertise. Two of the three godfathers of deep learning, Geoffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, are based at Canadian institutions. The country's AI ecosystem, Montreal, Toronto, Edmonton, is globally respected. Europe, on the other hand, has regulatory leadership. The EU AI Act is the most comprehensive artificial intelligence regulation on the planet. Now imagine what happens when Canadian AI capability meets European regulatory framework. You don't just get a partnership, you get a standard. A global standard that isn't written in Washington and isn't written in Beijing. A third way. Sabina Chiofu, International Policy Lead at UK Trade Association Tech UK, framed it perfectly. Whatever ends up in these trade agreements, data flow rules, AI cooperation frameworks, quantum technology protocols, it gives companies legal certainty. And legal certainty is what turns political speeches into actual business. She called it a generational opportunity for deeper transatlantic cooperation. Not a quarterly opportunity, not a fiscal year opportunity, generational. But let's be honest about the obstacles, because they're real and they're frustrating. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the EU, CETA, has been provisionally applied since 2017. Provisionally. For nearly a decade, full ratification has been blocked by objections from several member states, notably France and Ireland. In June 2025, both sides signaled intent to break the impasse, with Carney saying he wanted to deepen Canada's relationship with the bloc. But signals are not signatures. Canada faces a similar mess with post-Brexit Britain. Trade talks have stalled, and I wish I was making this up, partly because of a disagreement over cheese, beef, and cars. Cheese. While the world order fractures, grown adults in suits are arguing about cheddar imports. Ralph Goodale, then Canada's High Commissioner to London, suggested last December that 2026 would bring an ambitious new strategic partnership between Canada and the UK. That would be welcome, but it's overdue. And looming over everything is Donald Trump. The USMCA joint review could hamper Canada's ability to cut deals with Europe if Washington perceives those deals as a threat. Last June, Ottawa abandoned its planned digital services tax after the White House objected, a concession that might not have been necessary if Canada and the EU had already aligned their regulatory approach. This is the central tension. Canada needs to build bridges to Europe without burning them with Washington. It's a tightrope, but Carney, with his background in international finance, his understanding of how global capital actually moves, he might be the only leader positioned to walk it. Now here's the part that should excite every Canadian watching tonight. Cristina Caffarra, an economist and antitrust expert chairing the EuroStack initiative for European digital sovereignty, made an argument that applies just as powerfully to Canada. She said you do not create an industry by regulating monopolies. You create it by building, by investing, by using what she called brute force to develop domestic capabilities that can compete globally. And Caffarra didn't mince words about Europe's potential. She said Europeans have tremendous capabilities in aerospace, satellites, biotechnology, robotics, pockets of absolute total excellence. And then she said something that could easily be Canada's new motto: we need to just do it. That's the opportunity staring Canada in the face right now. Not just as Europe's resource supplier, not just as a defense partner, but as a co-architect of the rules that will govern technology, trade, and digital life for the rest of this century. Canada and Europe, working together, could build the most trusted digital ecosystem on the planet. Not the biggest, not the flashiest, the most trusted. And in a geopolitically volatile world, trust is the ultimate competitive advantage. Hullin asked the critical question, who will be first to be trusted in a geopolitically very volatile world? He said Canada and Europe could benefit enormously by working together on exactly that. Dear viewers, what we're watching unfold right now is not just a trade negotiation. It's not just a defense pact. It's the emergence of a third pole in global power, one built not on military dominance or market size, but on trust, rules, and strategic resources. Canada has the minerals, the AI talent, the democratic credibility. Europe has the regulatory frameworks, the industrial base, the market of 450 million consumers. Together, they don't need to outspend Washington or outproduce Beijing. They need to outtrust them. And that might be the smartest strategy on the board. If you believe Canada's role in the world is changing, if you believe this country can be more than America's northern neighbor, subscribe to Canada Next. Hit that notification bell, because we're going to keep tracking every move in this story. And trust me, the next chapter is going to be even bigger.